What I'm about to show you is unprecedented. This happened a couple of weeks back. The torch for the 2022 Winter Olympics was being lit. Suddenly, someone shouted, "How can Beijing be allowed to host the Olympics?" Watch this.
How can Beijing be allowed to host the Olympics, given that they are committing a genocide against the Uyghurs?
It's a valid question to ask. How can Beijing be allowed to host the Olympics? The world knows this. China is committing a genocide in Tibet and Xinjiang. How can it be allowed to host the Winter Olympics? Do you know what happened to those who asked this question? They were pushed to the floor by security and detained. They were taken to a police station. No charges were filed, but the message was quite clear. Protest is not an option. China will not allow anyone to oppose these games. When are they happening? Next year. The opening ceremony is on the 4th of February 2022. These are the Winter Olympics. They're being called the Genocide Games. Among the most controversial Olympics in history, this event is facing a massive backlash, but Beijing is being protected by complicit stakeholders and reluctant politicians the world over. On Gravitas tonight, we'll tell you how. We begin with the protests. They're growing by the day. You already saw what happened in Greece. They were denied a voice by the International Olympic Committee. But these protesters are not alone. They have the backing of human rights groups, advocacy groups, and celebrities. So far, more than 180 human rights organizations have called for a boycott of these games. They have a simple demand from world leaders: boycott the Olympics. Do not send your representatives and do not send players to compete. Is this an unprecedented request? It isn't. There is historical precedent. At least 6 Olympics have been boycotted in the past: the 1956 Melbourne Games, the 1964 Tokyo Games, the 1976 Games in Montreal, the Moscow Games in 1980, the Los Angeles Games in 1984, and the 1988 Games in Seoul. Wars, invasions, and apartheid were the reasons behind these boycotts. This time it's human rights. So what will world leaders do? Will they boycott the Genocide Games? Well, they're hesitant. They don't want a complete boycott, but they still want to be seen as doing something. So they have found a middle ground. They will send their teams, but none of the politicians will attend. They're calling it a diplomatic boycott. That's what America is considering, we're told. The White House is expected to make an announcement soon. US President Joe Biden is going to skip the event, as well as US government officials, all of them. America's friends in Europe have similar ideas. Back in July, the European Union decided to not send any diplomats. The UK too has declared a similar boycott plan. It was passed by the British Parliament. But the motion is non-binding, so it's a meaningless boycott, a half-hearted measure. Let me show you what a real protest looks like. This is Enes Kanter, a basketball star in the United States. He wants a boycott of the Winter Olympics. And he knows how to make a statement. Kanter has been hitting out at China through his shoes. Free China, stop organ harvesting in China, stand with Taiwan, free Hong Kong, and finally, no Beijing 2022. Kanter wore these shoes during NBA games. And by the way, basketball has a huge following in China. What do you think Beijing did when it saw these shoes? They censored Enes Kanter. And China did not stop there. Kanter's team, the Boston Celtics, were censored too. Their games were taken off television and the internet in China, and any video clips from the team were scrubbed off by censors. Despite the backlash, Kanter has been relentless in his protest.
There is a genocide happening right now. Right now, as I speak this message. Torture, rape, forced abortions, and sterilizations. Family separations, arbitrary detentions, concentration camps, political re-education, forced labor. Heartless dictator of China, Xi Jinping, and the Communist Party of China, I'm calling you out right now in front of the whole world. Close down the slave labor camps and free the Uyghur people. Stop the genocide now.
Kanter called Xi Jinping a heartless dictator. And China is very touchy about things like these. It is paranoid about protests. It doesn't want the games to be tarnished by protests, so it has started blocking people. Fans from overseas will not be allowed to attend the events. No foreigners, no protests. Critics at home can be managed. What about the other stakeholders? The International Olympic Committee or the IOC and the sponsors, what about them? They're proving to be a cakewalk. Let me tell you how. The IOC says that it wants to remain neutral, free from any politics, which is not fine. But if the IOC insists on this, being apolitical, how does it explain its previous lofty statements? Almost a year back, the International Olympic Committee came up with a human rights strategy. It said it would align the Olympics with the guiding principles of the United Nations. Great idea. Only it hasn't been implemented. When will they do it? After the Beijing Games, they say. How convenient is that? So it's a complete cop-out by the IOC. What about the sponsors? They choose to remain silent about China's human rights violations. 13 brands are top sponsors for these games. They include names like Coca-Cola, Airbnb, Procter & Gamble, Intel and Visa. A human rights group wrote to all of them. They were asked one question. Will they use their influence to corner China on human rights? Do you know how many sponsors replied? Just one. German financial services firm Allianz. And even they were non-committal. Why are these companies silent? Because there's big money involved. They make billions from the Chinese market. They don't want to ruin their balance sheets for human rights. Here is an estimate. 10 out of 12 overseas sponsors earn at least $110 billion from China. They won't speak out on human rights because they stand to lose billions in revenues. The world has known about China's genocide for years, but global institutions have failed to hold China to account. The Olympics are no different. The international system is not just protecting China, it is rewarding it. It's a system made up of weak global leadership, weaker sporting institutions, and companies that put profit above lives. Olympics have a track record of being on the wrong side of history. The best example of that is the Berlin Olympics of 1936. That's when Hitler hosted the Olympics. And even then there were demands for a boycott. There was a heated debate around it. Some countries threatened to pull out, but they failed to follow through. The world today refers to those games as the Nazi Games. And now history will repeat itself with the Genocide Games of 2022. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.